Do it as a woman personally, but because I'm a writer who writes against this regime, I do not think it's smart for me to even go to the border, because they've started targeting citizens sometimes too.
The golden age of America begins right now.
I mean, they've asked people, who did you vote for? So I have to find a place. I'm a little stateless in the world right now because Canada won't give me my PR.
Many partners to help us do that. And we're going to have to build our own factories in order to do that.
Why does it happen? Completely aside from the fact that I think it's a good thing, or I think that President Trump deserves political credit for it.
I think you're being too charitable to the motivations of this regime. I think you're, when we do basic political science theory, you're attributing rationalism to them that they don't have. Journalist, blogger, Kiev Post.
Yeah, tell me more about how you ended up being on a Russian wanted list.
Russia revealed a wanted list.
Today's guest, Dr. Kerry McElroy.
I am an international academic who straddles being a writer, a political journalist, investigative journalist, and a cultural historian. I did my PhD at Concordia in Montreal. I had 2 master's degrees before that at Columbia and Carnegie Mellon in the U.S. I'm an American citizen originally, but I've lived in Canada and abroad since 2009. So I've spent time in Europe, primarily in Canada, though. Post-PhD, I moved into more and more into political journalism, investigative journalism. I'm on the Russian ban and sanction list for some of my exposés about crimes at the Russian embassy in Ottawa. So I'm still an academic and a cultural historian, but I've moved more towards the public journalism side. And I have my next initiative is called the Saga Project, an international women's oral history and journalism collective, and that's launching in the next few months.
Dr. Kerry McElroy is our guest today. Let's get into it. Tell me more about how you ended up being on a Russian wanted list.
Yeah, so like I said, in my PhD, when I look back, I was sort of moving towards popular journalism. I have scholarly articles, magazine articles, series, and then little by little, I preferred to do public work and journalism and a little less in the academic realm. I didn't want to be a full professor anymore somewhere. Yeah. And so when I was doing more and more journalism in the last few years, and then like many of us, I don't know about people you've spoken to here, but many people have come to the Russia-Ukraine war from different avenues, right? Yep. A lot of people would look at me and they would assume I have a Ukrainian grandparent or something. They just think, oh, you have no, I have no Ukrainian ancestry at all. My interest was, to be honest, I was very outraged when the first reports of mass rape came out, because I thought, naively, maybe the world is sort of beyond that. I hadn't thought about psychopathologies of different armies.
And when was that? When did you come to that realization?
So the invasion, the full-scale invasion, was February 21st, 2022.
Got it, yeah.
And by May, the first reports were coming out of Kherson internationally.
Yeah.
Later, people I know who are on the ground, within the first weeks and months, there were a lot of mass rapes happening, right? But in the international community, we really started to be aware of it in around May. And that really lit a fire under me that, like, I want to apply my working on women and rape and histories of rape and trauma in societies to this conflict and this war. And so the reason I got on the list, it's a little bit of not a funny story, but it's a little cinematic. So my first articles were about rape in the war, and about how the internet, like certain artists and like international people in the community, artists, activists, mostly women, were doing these actions to shock people to pay attention to the fact that rape is happening. So a woman ran onto the red carpet at Cannes, and she had only underwear on and like fake blood, and her chest was painted yellow and blue, and it said, "Stop raping us." Mm-hmm. So these kind of shock, protest, art, activism movements were starting to happen. And I was one of the first people to say there's something going on here and to document that. But then from there, I moved into just real investigative journalism that doesn't have much to do with the gender or the sexual crimes. Yeah. I happened to be in front of the Russian embassy. There's an entire story about this. I don't know if you know about it, but I think it'll make a great documentary someday. Oh. There are Canadians, some Canadian Ukrainians, some Canadians of all kinds, some new arrivals from Ukraine who have been protesting in front of the Russian embassy on Charlotte Street in downtown Ottawa every day since the invasion. Rain or shine, they've never missed. -20, they never miss.
Until it's still ongoing until now.
Yeah. And they've formed this entire community. There's really a movie in this, I'm telling you. Like, I know these people quite well, and I go there and I interview them, and they're a really special group. There's been some crazy, almost comical interactions. The people in the embassy know them. They know the people in the embassy. They kind of troll each other. Some of them even live in the same building, which is
interesting.
Bonkers.
Okay.
That's its own thing. So I happened to be there one day. Long story short, I was there interviewing people as a journalist. And that evening there was an incident of, it was a very ham-handed, stupid act. Somebody vandalized the memorial to murdered Ukrainian children, which was a bicycle painted yellow and blue.
Yeah.
And the activists, every day they would, not every day, every time another child died, they would change the number on it. And it had flowers. So at that point, it was about 400 some children, I think. Now it's more, sadly. This was 2 summers ago, I think. And so what happened was that night, when no one was there, midnight, some car pulled up, vandalized the memorial, painted Z symbols, which is the sign for, the pro-Russian military sign.
Yeah.
So they painted Zs all over the sidewalk. They spray painted the bicycle black, which is a pretty profane act, let's say, no matter what side of a war you're on, to vandalize a memorial to murdered children. It's about as low as you can get in some ways. So a local man happened to be driving by, and he filmed them. And what he caught them red-handed, they were from inside the Russian embassy. They had Russian diplomatic plates on the car. So whether you're a good person or a bad person, don't be a stupid person. I mean, they got caught as you could be. So I was the first person, because I had known these people and been with them that day. I broke that story internationally before it ever got broken in Ottawa. That turned into a mini international incident. It got discussed in Parliament. Are we going to close the Russian embassy? Are we going to expel people? Because I had been writing a lot about the actions around embassies. That first few months, people were very angry. A lot of people were throwing red paint at ambassadors, throwing eggs. In European Russian embassies, there were a lot of actions. In Ireland, a man drove a truck through the gates, and then he went to the police and he said, "Go ahead, arrest me. I did my part." So the people's reaction, the outrage to what they were perceiving as Russian barbarity in this invasion, was pretty grassroots, let's say. And so there were things going on at the embassy in Ottawa. Lot of red paint. You can still see the red paint up there now because they couldn't get away with it all.
I drove around there.
Eggs, a lot of things. Somebody threw a Molotov cocktail. So the tensions were very high. And then this was about a year after the invasion when I wrote the story about the vandalism. And then that kind of went international. Like I said, there was discussion of if they would close the embassy. In the end, they did not. Yeah. These tensions still exist. The protesters are still there. This is all still going on. But because I happened to be the one that broke the story, the Russians did not like that. They called me a Banderite. They put me on. I'm going to frame this someday, but I'm on the list. It was every few months. I don't know if they're doing it now, but every few months they would put out
a list,
kind of Canadians who are pro-Ukraine. So it was activists, politicians, journalists, just anybody they perceived as being pro-Ukraine, and they want to kind of scare you by putting you on the list. Well, it actually makes your career over here.
Of course.
So thank you very much. But yeah, I was on there with the man who did the filming. Yeah. His name is Peter O'Neill. He works he's a Canadian government employee, so he made it on the list. But the Russians can be a bit silly. They want to look scary, and then they end up looking a little silly because they put somebody on there who's a PhD student who I interviewed. Yeah. So they made her look like a public figure, and she went, "Why am I on this list?" Right? So there's humor almost in it, and in the attempts to intimidate sometimes backfire, and it actually makes your career
certainly
better.
And is that when you ended up writing the piece on debunking the mysterious Russian soul?
No, I wrote that only a month ago.
This is very recent. This is pretty recent. Yeah. Tell me more about this piece, because it was quite interesting. What do we need to understand about the culture that enables such atrocities? Right.
And and it's a tough topic because humans don't want to be, there's a move away from, I'm working a lot on authoritarianism and fascism right now, and kind of returning to the mistakes of the 1930s and 40s and how much is paralleling in history right now in the world. And one thing is, after World War II and the Holocaust...
When you talk about authoritarian, you focus more on European and South America, a combination?
Right now, I'm kind of mostly looking at the roots for my next article and some other work I'm doing, I'm looking at fascism and Italy and the Third Reich and Stalinist Russia, Stalinist Soviet Union, and you know, kind of an Orwellian look at like what it's like to live in authoritarian societies and how they function and how they take power. Yeah. Because sadly, I think that is very much echoing what's happening in the U.S.
But I want to, you say that's a little bit similar to what is happening in the U.S. right now. Yeah. Try to make it a correlation in that.
When you look at cultural history, there was a movement in, let's say, 50s, 60s, 70s, the Frankfurt School, right? And studying totalitarianism and saying, how did this happen and how can it never happen again? And I think there was a movement back then, this has to do with French structuralists and intellectuals and movements and currents in intellectualism. People didn't want to believe in things like evil. People didn't want to be accused of being racist to say one culture might have a propensity to doing something that another one doesn't. Mm-hmm. And I think we have to be brave and we have to be honest and we have to say, no, certain cultures do have certain pathologies in them that contribute to the way that they act in, let's say, war, or in the way that gender relations happen in that culture, abuse of children, whatever it is, right? Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people shy away from that because in the academic world, it's considered stereotyping. Yeah. But I feel like I got a PhD in order to then do journalism, and I'm not afraid to speak. And I think we have to be honest. And
what have you found?
Right. So if you were to look, for example, at histories of Hitler, how did in German fascism, what was the psychopathology in the country that allowed him to come to power? People are comfortable with that because it feels like history, right? So there's hundreds of books like that. Mm-hmm. Why does a country choose an authoritarian leader? What's the gender relations in that country? What's their racial understanding? Whatever, that was all done. Yeah. So now people like me, and there's not a lot of us, are doing that with Russia, I guess you could say. And so to get to your question, what have I found? Yeah. So some of the people who are doing some of the most interesting research are kind of feminist international relations scholars who draw this analogy and this parallel between, like, let's say, domestic violence and domestic abuse. So in a country, Russia decriminalized domestic violence in 2017. Tens of thousands of women died in Russia between 2010 and 2020. It's, I want to say 11,000. I was just reviewing So when you decriminalize domestic violence, and this opens a whole nother can of worms, but a lot of people in the world don't see the conflict between Russia and Ukraine as a colonial conflict, or they can't see it through post-colonial lenses because we are conditioned in the rest of the world to see a white people group attacking another white people group as that cannot be colonial or post-colonial. In fact, there's amazing Ukrainian researchers framing this as a post-colonial conflict. And so if the premise is, and the supposition, and it's true, if there is a culture of abuse and violence at home, which includes something called devashina, it's called the reign of the grandfathers. It's the prison culture. It's a bullying culture. It's a hazing culture that's very prevalent in the military. So when we look at a culture of abuse of men of other men, including sexual abuse, when we look at a culture of prison hierarchy, that then spills to the military. Mm-hmm. When we look at a culture where domestic violence is decriminalized, when we look at a culture where Putin, who came in as a democratically elected president and then essentially morphed to a dictator, which is a playbook that has happened before, the month before the full-scale invasion, Putin was in press conferences making rape jokes. So they're these very intelligent and smart and astute people that I follow in my research and that I mentioned in these articles. They draw a direct line between, Zizek commented on it. There's a woman called Bonnie Stabile, wrote for Ms. Magazine in the first weeks after the invasion. Agata Wadlowska. These really smart people pointed out that, within the first few weeks after the invasion, this invasion has metaphors of domestic violence. It has a metaphor of a woman who wants to leave her husband, and he says, well, I'm going to kill you. If you try to leave me, I'm going to kill you. And so once you kind of look at this conflict through the lens of Russian cultural values, which includes Ukrainians aren't real, they don't get to leave, we decide who they are, but also they're lesser, they're the feminized and we're the masculine, basically. But also literally in that culture, how rampant it is and how normalized it is beating your wife, for example. Culture of alcoholism and violence against women.
Especially alcoholism.
Yeah, and the connection between vodka and the connection between vodka and domestic violence, which is, really.
True, it is.
Even the cultural history of vodka in Russia, when there were movements to decrease it, the czars were making money off vodka. And so they wanted to keep the people enslaved to vodka. It's like a crack epidemic in the US or something, you know? So all of this stuff comes together in very specific ways. The military culture, the prison culture, taking prisoners out of prison, including murderers and rapists, and saying, if you go to Ukraine and you fight for 3 months and you're not killed, which the chances are very likely that you will be, but if you'll be a hero when you come home. You don't go back to prison. Yeah. So they unleashed a bunch of rapists onto the country. And now Russia has its own problem because when those rapists go home, now they're raping Russian women.
Yeah. Why is it so important to shift from the focus to Russia's history of violence and impunity when discussing the current war?
To shift to understanding of history?
Yeah.
Because it's not over. Right. You know, I love history. I'm a cultural historian, and one of my all-time favorite quotes is from William Faulkner, and he says, you know, I'm paraphrasing it. It's a famous one. I should know it by heart by now, but the past is never really over. The past isn't even past. Yeah. And of course, in history, you know, every African nation, right? We were talking about this at the beginning. Yeah. Trauma, countries reliving their past. So one of the people I rely on the most in my work and admire the most in my work is an Estonian playwright she's a feminist writer and also a playwright. So she works on fictional adaptations of these same themes. So her name is Sophie Oksanen, and she wrote a play called Purge that then became a film. It became a book. It's gone multimedia. And the entire story is just reminding us that women, especially women, but not just women, but people from Eastern Europe, right? People who live in countries that were colonized and were part of the Eastern Bloc and were part of the Soviet Union against their will, their grandmothers were mass raped. You know, we can look at the rape of Berlin in 1945. That's in my article. 5% of babies born in Berlin in 1945 were classified on their birth certificate, raped. Parentheses, Russian. So it's accepted. They were given pamphlets that said, take the women as your rightful spoils, you know, eradicate their racial pride, their ethnic pride, meaning the German women, but not just the German women. It's a long way from Moscow to Berlin, right? So Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, all of these countries that are along the way, those women were raped. Even the Allies, when you go back and look at their the kind of classified reports, even the Germans, even Goebbels said they didn't believe that the mass rape and murder that was happening as the Russians moved from east to west they thought that was propaganda to scare them. And then they found out that it was really happening as badly as they said. And many women were raped more than once. So what I'm saying is the cultural memory of women in that part of the world is that when Russians come to your land, they rape. And that is what you should expect, basically. And we are not that far from that generation. So when Oksanen writes this book, Purge, and then writes her essays, which she's got one called Putin's War on Women, and she's directly connecting exactly what I'm saying. The way that they are waging war in Ukraine now reflects that they've never repudiated their military's use of rape. That use of rape is condoned. It's a way for the soldiers to have fun and let off steam, but also our neighbors are lesser than us. They're lucky we're here. So we will do what we want when we come here. It's a extreme cultural imperialism and cultural arrogance. So therefore, there's no apologies for mass rape. There's no acknowledgement of mass rape. So Oksanen has said it's not surprising that they are repeating the same patterns because they celebrate the soldiers. They call that the Grandfather's Regiment. And on May 9th, which is coming up, they parade around with their pictures. Well, the Soviet army that went in, helped to liberate Europe in 1945 was an army of mass rapists. And if we don't acknowledge that, we don't understand. Russians certainly don't understand, like they don't acknowledge it. How dare you talk about the grandparents, right? Yeah. So when you don't acknowledge that, then history repeats. And that's where it is. So
you mentioned something about, we see what's happening in the United States right now. Do you see any trends of the American society going towards authoritarian or the culture, adopting some of the practices that based on your studies, essentially, on authoritarian regimes? Do you see a trend in the United States, maybe in terms of culture, men and how they behave? And are you seeing that?
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah. I wasn't totally following because I would say, and I'm not afraid to say what I think is the truth. As an American citizen who lives in Canada, my life is very much impacted by what's happening there. You know, I worry about my family. am making my own practical considerations on where to live or not live based on what's happening there. And I'm also a dissident journalist from this regime, so I'm not unbiased by any means. I think the U.S., by my standards, think of someone like Timothy Snyder, the professors who fled Yale and these historians of authoritarianism and fascism and now have established themselves at University of Toronto. That's a canary in the coal mine. So I don't think there's any dispute amongst my peers and people I respect and myself that the U.S. is moving into authoritarianism and is already there and is in a constitutional crisis. That aside, what does that have to do with sort of sexual violence and mass rape? That's a very interesting question. I wrote an article about that last summer, connecting the fact that Trump is a serial rapist. He's a convicted sexual offender. So you've elevated this man who, in any normal country, would have nipped it in the bud after January 6th. And, if someone tries to do an insurrection and you don't stop them, and then they come back, it's like, what is it? You shoot for the king, you best not miss, right? Yeah. Now he's back. Okay, but there's an entire Wikipedia page of 70 Donald Trump's sexual allegations, his associations with Jeffrey Epstein. One of those accusers just committed suicide the other day. So none of that is over. None of to me, it's a rapist in chief. So just like, as I said, when you look at Putin, when you follow the pathologies of the dictator on down, if Putin makes rape jokes about Ukraine, don't be surprised when the Russian soldiers in Ukraine think it's funny to rape women and write graffiti on the wall about how much fun they're having doing war crimes, right? You have that same trollishness in the U.S., absolutely, because little boys are seeing a man who's convicted of rape elevated to be the president. Well, now it's an authoritarian crisis. But I mean, what that does to little girls and little boys and young men and young women.
Young men especially.
Horrific. And this whole thing about the manosphere, right? The Andrew Tate influence.
The red pillars and stuff. Yeah.
I don't think, of course you can't separate that. Mm-hmm. Trump's own son is a freshman at NYU. He's 18 or 19 years old. He's the one that told him last year to go on those red-pilled bro podcasts. And he captured a lot of these Gen Z boys. I always forget that those of us who have been kind of speaking out against him and fighting against him as a rapist since 2016, these kids were like, he's all they've known. They were like 4. He's always been in their face. So they think, oh, people say politicians have crimes. No, they don't understand. He's the first president to be a convicted felon. And the sexual crimes is not normal. But to them, it's normal because they've grown up in this like hyper-saturated media atmosphere, I think. And so that's a huge can of worms, and I'm delighted to talk about it, but it's a terrible topic because it's a great example, I think, of the same way we can apply this, pathology look at Russian culture, what's happening in the U.S., I don't think you can separate from the gender politics and the sexual violence. And so this article I wrote last summer was about Kamala Harris being a prosecutor and him being a felon. And I've thought, surely people will make the right choice. Yeah. That's another issue. I mean, about how that happened and why. But it was so cinematic. It was like the prosecutor who prosecutes sex criminals and versus the man who's this. He's also very, he's elderly. He's from another time. The way he speaks about women, and he's 80s. He's, Atlantic City. Like we thought that was over.
Atlantic City.
And it's not over. It's a resurgence of that kind of misogyny. When he came out at the Republican National Convention last summer, he came out, I said that this was stochastic terrorism. It was stochastic violence. Nobody else paid attention, really. I mean, because with him, it's a deluge. It's all the time. Yeah. He came out to the song It's a Man's World by James Brown. To come out, to be a convicted sexual criminal and to come out on stage to that song, why don't you just tell the women of the country, I'm a rapist and I'm going to do what I want? And then when he was on the campaign trail, he literally said, I'm going to protect the women of this country whether they want it or not.
Okay, yeah.
So all this rape discourse, this, Putin does it, he does it. Now this is another can of worms, but this is my next article. The way he speaks about Canada, the way he speaks about Greenland.
Let's talk. Let's
annexation
expand.
Is the language of rape.
Annexation, because when I was having a conversation with Natalia the last time, and instead of saying the Ukraine joining NATO, I would say NATO annexing Ukraine, and that was kind of a very sensitive thing because when you understand, annexation itself, we're here talking about total dominance of one nation. What do you think? Yeah, let's talk about the 51st state. Yeah, just tell me what do you think about that, and how do you what do you think that is coming from, and what is your observation in terms of what's going to be unfolding?
Oh boy! This is what my next article is about, and it has very little to do with the gender politics, except for what I just said, which I think is a really important point.
Yeah.
When a country, Trump is learning from his puppet master, Putin, in how to speak, whether there's an overt link or this is just, there are theories, right? Yeah. We don't want to get conspiratorial. But when Putin talks about Ukraine as,
my woman.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Trump is talking about Canada that way now. And Canada might be geographically bigger, but it's the weaker partner. There's a feminized metaphor here. So to me, the language of annexation is a language of rape, and we have to be honest about that, because you're saying, I'm going to take you whether you want it or not. I want you, and it's not your choice, it's my choice. Your body, my choice. So when he talks about Greenland, when he talks about Ukraine, he doesn't, Putin talks about Ukraine. When Trump talks about Canada, when Trump talks about Greenland, when Trump talks about Panama, he is in the Putin playbook of, we're the macho, we're the superpower, and we'll take what we want. And it's highly dangerous. Needless to say, it's against the entire international order. That's why we have a UN. You never would have expected the U.S. to be speaking that way, but he is not a normal president, and he's not operating within normal political norms. Now, why is he doing it? Mm-hmm. I have several theories.
Okay, go. Let's touch on them.
Again, it gets a little. It gets a little. It's not just conspiratorial. It's just the more you know, the darker it is. Because my next article is about. As of now, the tentative title is. Slava Canada, Slava Greenland. So it's making the direct parallel, right? Now, today we have election day in Canada.
Yeah.
I think Canadians see what's going on down there as a horror show. They don't want to make the same mistake. So that's how the Conservatives have blown a 25-point lead. Also, women don't tend to like Poilievre. He gives off a misogynist vibe, and he was involved with the red pill manosphere as well. So...
for some time, and I think he's taking a step back as we're getting closer to today.
Just like Trump tried to stop talking about the 51st state,
exactly,
but he couldn't quite zip it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think Canadians are, we all live here. People are furious. Yeah. People don't, it's not a joke to them. People go on vacation and Americans make a joke about the 51st state and they say, it's not funny to us. Is a rape joke funny? So that's happening. But now as far as why they're doing this, that gets into some very distressing geopolitical realities, that how much Elon Musk has been involved as a shadow president, how much this kind of dark techno-futurist, techno-fascist vision of creating a fascist states of America. I know it sounds conspiratorial, but I'm doing a lot of research on this. Like, Elon Musk's grandfather was in the Canadian Nazi Party. The reason he chose to go to South Africa when he was expelled is because he wanted to live in an apartheid state. None of this is new, and none of it is over. That group was called Technocracy Inc., the parallel group to Elon Musk's Canadian Nazi Party, the grandfather's roots. Technocracy Inc. wanted to create a fascist states of America. You can. I have the map as my image of my next article. Greenland, Canada, and all the way down to the top of South America. So I don't think, they're certainly not joking, and they're not trolling, and that's what he wants. His followers who are quite cultish say, oh, he's just joking, he's just funny. There's nothing joking about this. There's nothing funny about this. So they're not joking. Some people say, well, he wants the rare earth minerals. He wants the raw materials. Sure. But he's also legitimizing Putin's rape-like view of expansion in the world, because I think he works for and with Putin. And he's also speaking to even more sinister visions, I think, of people who are trying to destroy the U.S. from within and use it to create this kind of new world order that is very sinister, let's say.
Yeah. And how do you correlate that to people that would say that, the United States is trying to get the United States is attempting to gain control of the international economy or the international security in terms of, some of the actions some people would say that these are related to, those kinds of, futuristic ambitions of the United States regaining power and regaining control of the international, governance, I would say, military-wise and economically.
Well, there's two things going on at the same time, right? Which is why this whole situation for the last 100 days is so crazy-making. And I always tell my students, my family, I say, when it seems irrational, it's because it is irrational. And you have to look at what would people who are trying to dismantle a state do? And then these things make sense. Because as you say, every state wants power. Trump wants power, but Trump he comes from a gangster world in New York City. He's also a television host. So he's out for revenge. He has his grievance politics. That's why he's going after Harvard and Columbia and Stanford in particular, because they rejected his son. That's the truth. Oh. That's why. So I also know, because I went to Columbia, that the exact amount of money that he demanded from Columbia University in New York City had to do with a botched real estate deal he did with them in the 80s. So he's an angry old gangster man. So you have that. You have the psychology of the leader who wants his grievance, he wants his power, he wants to sign papers and look like the king. Do it as a woman personally. But because I'm a writer who writes against this regime, I do not think it's smart for me to even go to the border, because they've started targeting citizens sometimes too.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, they've asked people, who did you vote for? They've asked people to look through their phones.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm. So if I wouldn't do it last time, and last time wasn't as bad as we thought it would be, I mean, it was chaotic and it was crazy, but he was checked a lot. This time I absolutely would not go. So I have to find a place. I'm a little stateless in the world right now because Canada won't give me my PR.
You're welcome to Congo.
Well, have you ever, like, digital nomad and remote worker visas?
Yeah.
So when I started bookmarking them, and there were like 15 at the time, I've been looking into this for 2 years, because there's tax considerations, there's all these different considerations.
Yeah.
Now there's 66 countries that have them. I know there's a few in Africa. I think like Mauritius, maybe, Madagascar.
Rwanda would have one, for sure.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah.
So I would love to go back to Europe because I feel very comfortable there. I speak languages and things, but the time zone thing, I'm making the most money on, I kind of have to figure that stuff.
Yeah.
Some things like taxes. So for now, the idea is to go down for 7 months. I'm going to be in Aruba and Curacao, probably, like the Dutch Caribbean, because I've already tried out British and I don't want to drive on the British side. I can't. So I'm going to go to Aruba and Curacao this time. And then try to come back into Canada in March. But with all these tensions, we can't predict day to day. I might get some border agent who's mad at the U.S. and sees my U.S. passport, doesn't want to let me in.
Yeah.
So I've got to make contingent. I feel like a 1930s intellectual hopping countries at this point, because I'm not married, I don't have kids, so I have a lot of freedom to go
and travel. Yeah.
But the flip side is, like, I don't want to end up at a wrong border. So it's
crazy, like being an American and to feel like the way you feel.
I know.
It's crazy.
I know.
It's crazy.
And the first time around 2016 to 2020, I mean, I'm sure some people thought I was overreacting, but like I said, it was more principle at that point. You know? This time it's more like genuinely, like, I would be stupid to go.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Because of the articles I've written, and the Russians are not. So
in the United States, what list are you on?
Oh, that was just my friend was writing an article for Vice magazine.
Okay.
And they were doing like a deep dive on different white supremacist and neo-Nazi groups, like extremist groups.
Yeah.
And they were keeping lists of like enemies of the state kind of thing.
And you were? My
name was on there, yeah. So 2 countries lists. The Russian one,
Russia
the Russian
and the
one
United
is
States.
Official, though. It looks really cool. I'm going to get it framed because it's got my name in Cyrillic.
Oh, wow.
And then it says journalist, blogger, Kiev Post. And I think that's all it says. It's a list of 100 and I'm number 98. I made it at the bottom.
So let's talk about Doge. So when we look at what's going on in the world right now, the United States has been on top of the world economically for many years. They feel like they are behind China in terms of how the economy is functioning. I am looking at the amount of money that the United States has spent over the past 40 years, close to $14 trillion of support that the United States has sent out. China has had a little bit over 25 years of economic spike. And if you look at what they've used the proceed of that development towards is to improve the infrastructure and reinvest that money into their people. What is your observation about that?
I think you're being too charitable to the motivations of this regime. I think you're, when we do basic political science theory, you're attributing rationalism to that they don't have. I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with a country protecting its own economic interests. And if you want to look at a kind of coherent economic policy towards, let's say, a trade imbalance with China, or economic relations with Europe or Australia or any country, right?
Yep.
You can look to how a normal administration, whether you're a Democrat or you're a Republican, how did the Biden administration approach China? How even did George W. Bush's administration? I was no fan. I did not vote for them, but they were operating within the normal limits of American politics. What you have now is, for example, Peter Navarro is Trump's economic advisor, right? First of all, he's another convicted felon. He's been to prison. Secondly, he was brought in because Jared Kushner found he was the one intellectual book that he could find supporting tariffs and trade. Well, now when people have poured through that book, he's citing a famous economist that's an anagram of his own name. These are not serious people. Their policy is not serious. It's completely incoherent. It's driven by grievance. It's driven by a nostalgicized past that is not realistic. And I don't know if we were recording then or if we were just chatting, but you cannot create autarky in a globalized world that you helped to create. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. You're going to have to work with global partners. If you feel that the U.S. is falling behind in a certain way, you're going to have to make that up in some other ways, but you can't create Stalinist autarky and say we're going to create, we're going to make screws and iPhones in the U.S. Even if you wanted to do that, it would take 20 years. But as I was saying to you, the irony of the fact that it's Trump's billionaire buddies who sold off the U.S. factories and created this system. So now he's selling the grievance to the Americans who live in Nebraska and Wisconsin. They say, where did our factories go? Oh, the Chinese took your factories. No, his friends took the factories to make money and gave them to China. And now they're going to try to use that as a populist politics to be mad at who? You did this. You created this system. You can't uncreate the system now. So, I mean, not to be a hippie and an idealist, but there are ways that the world can work. Globalization can be positive. There's really no other way to go. I just think, despite my absolute loathing of this administration and thinking that they're a bunch of criminals and fools, they cannot do what they're trying to do. Whether they believe in it seriously or they don't, it's a non-starter. It's not possible.
That's a good point. Yes, that's actually very true. Because when you think about globalization, we are talking about the division of labor, and in the United States, it's becoming evident that it's quite impossible to essentially bring back all those jobs that have already left the United States. But I think the thought when we look back and look at you mentioned George Bush and how they interacted, but more specifically Joe Biden, who had maintained and retained some of the Trump's policy against China.
Yeah, that's
true. So when you think about that, and because I've spoken with a lot of people and I've read a lot of articles of people that primarily do support Trump. And their position is that a lot of administrations prior to Trump's administrations have attempted or have at least have mentioned or have, I do have a little bit of clips. They've mentioned and expressed they willing to essentially, combat China's position, or at least try to create a little bit of balance between the United States economy and China and the Chinese economy. But they feel like Trump is the person with the courage to do it. What do you think about that?
No. There's absolute questions of intellectual espionage, for example, right? Yeah. The Biden administration really pushed that CHIPS Act. They were very proud of that. So it's not that other other administrations are kumbaya and say, let's just cede the trade field to China and let's just all hug and be friends. Of course, countries are going to have, but as far as courage, because, and this goes back to, this common theme in my work and my worldview of like, let's not be afraid to look at things like psychopathologies. I don't think you can attribute courage to someone who himself doesn't understand the basic economic policies of what he's doing. And all you need to know that is that every single world economist, both while he was running, when he was on the campaign trail, since in the last month when he made a U.S. meltdown of the economy and a global, everybody told him, tariffs are not going to work. What you're trying to do isn't going to work. And in large historical reference, look at what happened in 1929 and 1930, right? Like, everybody told him this wouldn't work. Now, again, is he doing this deliberately to help tank? Some people talk about some of these forces want to put the U.S. on crypto. He's having a very close relationships with this El Salvadorian dictator who's put El Salvador on crypto, Bukele, and is also outsourcing his gulags to him. So as much as these things sound wild and conspiratorial, I don't think they are. I think he wants to win against China because he sees himself as the strongman politician who wants a win. He's about his polls. He's about Fox News. He's about his optics. But the people around him have different economic understanding and different motivations. So I just don't think we can attribute normal statesman qualities to this man or political motivations. It's not a normal regime. It's not a normal group. The people in that group have different motivations, which some of includes destroying the global economy.
Yeah.
So
okay, thank you. And let's talk about his involvement or the U.S. involvement in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. What do you think has been? What do you think? Do you see that the United States involvement has created a lot more damage to the war, and the search for peace is becoming a lot more impossible because of the United States involvement?
No, I mean, I don't pretend to be neutral. Okay. I'm a journalist, but I'm extremely pro-Ukrainian, and because I'm pro-democracy and anti-rape, torture, and anti-human rights abuse, I do not think I'm as staunchly Ukrainian position as if you were speaking to someone here who's a Ukrainian, pretty much.
Yep.
Now, in that position, Russia had absolutely no right. Ukraine is a sovereign nation. So from the minute they crossed the border, both in 2014 and 2022, they're breaking international law. They're doing war crimes. I think NATO is a red herring in some ways. I think Ukraine has the right to join NATO if they want to. I think that the nefarious influence of the U.S. is a lot of times Russian influence propaganda. I don't believe in any of those narratives. I just don't. And I think if you research from my circles, the facts would back that up. So if that's my starting point, then I would say the U.S. didn't. I would be of the school that the U.S. hasn't intervened enough. That I would be from the pro-Ukraine position since 2022 that, kind of people were criticizing someone like Jake Sullivan in Biden's administration. Well, you're giving them enough weapons to keep them fighting and to keep them sovereign, but you're not giving them enough weapons to win or to push the Russians out of the occupied territories. So they kind of created this untenable situation. Now, in the defense of the people who did this, including the Europeans who have been pretty timid, people are afraid of nuclear war. Russia is sort of like a child with a gun waving it around, and they push that in their narratives. They want people to be afraid of them. We're crazy. You don't know what we're going to do, right? If Russia didn't have nuclear weapons, the whole world would have gone in and stopped this in 1 week, the way that they went in and invaded, stopped Saddam Hussein in Kuwait in 1990. That's just facts. The only reason that this has continued the way it is because we're in this sort of nuclear stalemate. Now, so I'm not the ruler of the world. It's an impossible position. It's like a sword of Damocles, right? You're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. If you help Ukraine too much, you might trigger World War III. If you don't help them enough, people are being tortured, they're suffering. You're also not backing up international law. If you don't help them at all, you're essentially telling a dictator that he can go in and do, and we know what happened in the 1930s when appeasement and all that. Yeah. So it's a very hard, I don't fault people like in the Biden administration as much as some people on my side do, that like to know how to proceed. I think they did the best they could. Now, that being said, this administration, again, I know I'm a broken record with this, I do not attribute good faith or normal political actor motivations to them. I think on the case of Russia and Ukraine, if you want proof that Trump works with and for Putin, all you have to do is look at the policy now on this. They've disbanded American think tanks and funded projects that were helping to investigate Russian war crimes. Paul Manafort, how far back do you want to go? There's millions of people. It's just so much evidence that it becomes conspiratorial because it's too wild for people to think that the American president would be working in concert with the Russian dictator. Now, whether it's because they have business dealings or because he owes him something or there's compromise or blackmail, people can speculate about that.
What do you attribute to the Ukrainians, political decisions or stances to the war? First, to the full-scale invasion, before the invasion, through the negotiation before the invasion. If we look at 2014, for example, is there any part of that war that you would attribute to Ukraine?
No.
Or the political system itself?
No.
No. Okay. What about are you familiar with the Minsk agreement? Okay. Can you tell me more about the Minsk agreement, if you do understand it, and what do you think happened, and why was that not settled, and why?
And that's a great example.
That did not lead to a peaceful situation. Because
the people who committed to protecting Ukraine's sovereignty in the face of Russian aggression, which they've been dealing with for literally centuries. And what I said is, if we see this as a colonial and a post-colonial struggle, right? They didn't honor their part of the bargain. So people who get, let's say... And
we're talking about NATO. Okay.
No. Well, specifically, who were the signatories was the UK and the US. So that's not even NATO as an institution. That's nations who signed that, right?
Promised.
So when we say, I think in certain narratives where certain parts of the world, Russian misinformation, Russian narratives permeate. And that's a whole nother topic of, I work on disinformation and propaganda and how they push narratives into media spaces, let's say. And so a lot of times what people say, you can tell where they're getting information. So if they start talking about Ukrainian biolabs, then you know that they're getting a lot of Russian disinformation. If they're talking about NATO as this, this force that caused this, right? Trump propagates some of that rhetoric these days. Then I know where they're getting their information. But the fact is that, again, Ukraine has every right to join a defensive alliance. And there is a little bit of a joke. There have been political cartoons. I'm not going to tell it right, but there's sort of a knock of Russia knocking on Ukraine's door as the Grim Reaper and saying, let me in. And they say, no, you're going to kill us. And then he says, well, I'm going to kill you if you don't let me in, basically. So it's this circular madness, right? But if you're a country who has been threatened by your larger neighbor for hundreds of years, why would you not want to join a defensive alliance? But now that defensive alliance doesn't want to let you in completely because they don't want to trigger World War III. And so everybody's caught between a rock and a hard place here, including the West. The only people not caught between a rock and a hard place are Russia, because who asked them to invade their neighbor? Now, they have their reasons. I think their reasons are barbaric. So, but as far as going back, like as you say, going back to the Minsk agreements, Ukraine was promised, and for what? In response to, in response to giving up their nuclear weapons. So maybe they should have kept their nuclear weapons and not counted on their friends to be there for them when this happened, because here we are.
Yeah, let's try to be realistic as possible. The reality is that Russia is an invader. Russia has had for years very barbaric, as you mentioned, positions against their neighbors. When we look back at, let's say, the invasion in Crimea and how they took over Crimea and all of those things, from the Russia's perspective, some of the Russians that were living in that area were not essentially didn't have the human rights protected. What do you say to that? What do you think about that?
Nonsense. Russia does that continuously in disinformation and propaganda, both contemporarily and historically. So Russia, if you look at how did they repopulate after, during the years of the Soviet Union? Yeah. They when they want to get control over a region, So they sent a bunch of people from Korea to Ukraine. They sent a bunch of people from Estonia to Vladivostok in the Asian part of Russia. Then they send in their own people, including right now in Mariupol, where they murdered maybe 80,000 people, and now they're building condos. So they send in their own people. Are you
saying that these people were planted into Crimea?
I'm saying the Russian method, and they're not very slick about it, is that they send in their own people, and then one generation later they say Russians are oppressed here. Well, you put those people there because you ethnically cleanse the people who there actually were there and the real people of that land, which includes Eastern Ukraine, which includes Crimea.
Yeah.
To me, it's not as complicated as people like to make it.
That's a very common practice in Congo. Mm-hmm. So I believe you've read about the conflict between Congo and Rwanda. There are some folks from Rwanda that moved generations ago, moved to Congo, and they've had families and they've raised their kids there. And one of the justification for Rwanda to invade Congo is we want to protect those people.
Yeah.
So I can understand that.
Yeah. I think people lose sight of sovereign borders in light of questions of language, or you're oppressing. Now, do you think really Russia cares about human rights? Look at how they treat their own prisoners. Look at how they treat, it's a red herring for them.
That's very obvious. I think it would take someone that has been completely brainwashed by the Russian propaganda to not understand that there is something wrong in Russia in terms of their culture. It's absurd and pathetic.
But also that they care really about the Russian people in Crimea. They've planted them there. They also had military bases there that never went away, including when Khrushchev gave Crimea to Ukraine.
Crimea, yeah.
Right?
Mm, yeah.
So they say a lot of things, let's say.
Yeah. And okay, let's get back to your business. So you do work with students that are primarily from Europe. Is it most of your students?
No. I've in my admissions and education work, consulting. No, primarily North America, and then a lot in Europe and some in China as well.
So most of your students do come from North America?
Mm-hmm. At this point, yeah.
Oh, so it's American students in America.
A lot of them, yeah.
Okay, got it. Okay, and so tell me more about how you do manage to recruit the students that do come from places like Asia and Europe and Ukraine. How does the process work?
Yeah, well, we were talking, I think, a little just chatting before we started today, and I have a real ethos that connects my political activism work, my journalism work, and my education consulting work, because journalism is not a lucrative business these days. So if you can make more money in a area where there is money to be made, then you can pay that forward and trickle that into your other, doing good work with writing and journalism and activism. So I've tried to unite all of these things, and I think I'm getting there.
Yeah.
And so the answer is there are very wealthy families who need services from people like me, admissions consultants, education consultants, private tutors. A lot of those are in US, a little in Canada, some in Europe, lots in China, for example. These are elite families, right? Their kids are doing great work. We want to help them do well. But from there, I then do kind of pro bono work and advocacy work for students in Ukraine, because it's a very compelling story to help top students get into top universities around the world, not just because they're top students, but because they're doing science experiments in their kitchen under air raid sirens, and they go into bomb shelters and bring their school notebooks and they study. That's reality. It's very compelling, as it helps you get into a school because it's a good story, but it's also the truth. So every time I'm able to I call it my Robin Hood plan, the more money I make from the elites, the more I can help students who actually need it, who are from developing nations, or, so as of right now, that's mostly Ukraine, because I'm very involved with this war and I have a lot of students there that I help, but I would like to do that with many countries. And
you also expanded on, because one of the challenges that we do have in our agency is to essentially recruit students that do not have the financial capacities. Right. So how do you go about that? How do you overcome that?
Yeah, so we had talked about that a little before. I'm not a financial aid expert. In fact, I'm probably would give wrong advice, right? I'm help people tell their story. Yeah. I help them
More of the
silly as it
admission
sounds,
portion.
reach their dreams, right? So
Yeah.
even making the lists of where do you want to go to school? What are your, we talk about their goals and their dreams, and we build their extracurriculars and their service projects, and then the writing is really, really important, and telling your story and doing your narrative and all that stuff. So what I usually explain to them is like, what I don't want to happen to you is to get your heart broken that you get into an amazing international school and then you can't attend because of the funds.
Yeah.
So while we're building your lists, while we're working on your applications, while we're telling your story in a way that may make you a really compelling candidate to international top universities, I want you to also be talking to someone in your country who's an expert on the financial side. Now, that being said, as you and I had talked about earlier, I think off camera, most of the really elite universities have moved to need-blind admissions anyway. They are not going to turn someone away because they don't have the money. They have multi-billion-dollar endowments. They want, if someone is a top young scientist, let's say in Congo, they won in top 5 competition in some kind of science competition or something, they are way more likely to get into something like an Ivy League school. Well, once they're accepted, they're not going to say, oh, you don't have $75,000 a year, you can't come. They know that the person doesn't have $75,000 a year.
Certainly.
They're trying to build the most genius classes, and especially, not to circle back to it, but in light of the Trump regime's assault on these higher education institutions, I suspect that while they might pay lip service to what he wants because they're afraid of him, some of them are standing up, some of them are not, the diversity behind the movement towards more diversity and helping people from underprivileged backgrounds it's not going to go away. It's actually going to probably be stronger because it's a form of subversion to fight back against this administration. They're trying to tell people next they want to say who can be a professor there and what can you teach. We see what they've done with whitewashing history, taking the Tuskegee Airmen off the walls of the military institutes and stopping talking about First Nations people's heroics in World War II, getting rid of the women astronauts. They're literally whitewashing history. So the universities are going to have to push back against that even more by really making even more of an effort to build diverse classes, multicultural classes, and not, maybe some of them are afraid to fight him in court. You can fight him in the admissions offices.
Certainly. All right, great. Good point. Thank you very much for your participation to our podcast, Dr. Kelly. That's all for today, and we hope to have you on our podcast again.
Thank you. My pleasure.
All right. Thank you.
Okay.